Welcome, everybody. Sorry, that's really loud. Thanks for joining us on such a beautiful day. We can't tell in this forum, it's such a beautiful sunny day, but it is a gorgeous November afternoon. Thank you so much for taking the time to spend it with us here today, and welcome our penultimate guest speaker of Fall Quarter. I'll give a brief announcement about our speaker next week prior to introducing today's speaker. Amanda Mellon from the University of Calgary will be joining us and talking about adaptability and plasticity in the gut microbiome of capuchin monkeys. She's joining us from University of Calgary. We still have a few open slots for office hours, so even if you're not an anthropologist, her research is fascinating and is broadly applicable across multiple domains. So please do let Emily Rossman or Andy or me know. If you're online, please drop something in the chat and we can send you the link to sign up for office hours. Second announcement about next week is that we will not be here at Chambers, but we will be hosting our guest at Kellogg's Global Hub in room 1120. That will go out with the announcements next week, but just a heads up, if you come here, we won't be here. So please show up at the Global Hub next week. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Cristian Huepe is a theoretical physicist who conducts research in physical, biological, technological, social, and artistic complex systems. Broad ranges. His current work focuses on active matter evolutionary networks, swarm robotics, digital anthropology, and the art science boundary. His research aims to uncover the fundamental mechanisms that lead to emergent behavior and self-organization in a variety of contexts. He uses tools spanning analytical calculations and simulations to experimental collaborations and data analysis. Huepe is the founder of the C. Huepe Labs in Chicago. He's the director of the Social Listening Lab in the Universidad Católica de Chile. And he is a research professor not only here at Northwestern, he is external faculty of NICO, as well as Beijing Normal University and Universidad Católica de Chile. Please join me in welcoming Cristian Huepe.
Hello, hi to everybody. It's great to be here. So for me, this is also a little bit of a event. It's been only about a month, as the two postdocs sitting here know very well, that I've been coming out and about in the city and giving some talks in different places. That's a lot because a year ago I had a little child who's now a year old since a couple of days. And he's finally fully vaccinated. So just now, right, like about a month ago, he's fully vaccinated. We can go around and about. And I think that that brings us well into the subject of today, because one of the things that I'm going to talk about is how people understand vaccines. The only reason why I'm here in many ways, and I can be somewhat relaxed that even if I get sick or if Leo gets sick, the vaccine, but most people don't understand that. The only reason why we're kind of past the pandemic is because of vaccine, but in most people's minds, vaccine is a nuisance that they force them to have somehow and has no relationship with the fact that now we're ending the pandemic. The pandemic kind of just passed by. And I think that that's a lot because we're terrible at explaining what we do in science, and a lot because we are also really bad at understanding how people think and how people communicate. So that brings me really to the subject today, where I will tell you about research that we did in Chile to understand how people thought about the vaccines and the vaccine introduction during the whole process that most of it was last year. As the introduction said, I'm a little bit in several places. I'll talk a little bit about that. But in particular, this work was done with the SOL lab, Social Listening Lab, which depends of the Universidad Católica de Chile. And it also received support from the Faculty of Communications, which hosts the lab, and also of the Millennium Institute, who actually brought most of the vaccines to Chile originally when they first arrived. This work, by the way, I forgot to mention this, was a lot of co-authors, including Claudio Villegas. He's now working in the Chilean government because he's very talented, and a big team in Sol. And it will be up here probably in 2 weeks about time in scientific reports, most of the things that I'll be telling you about. So first, this is to serve a little preface because I do a lot of things, and one question of how I got here. So I would define myself, in addition to the introduction, as a theoretical physics studying complex systems in all kinds of places and spaces. Technological, also human and artistic. Definitely human is what I'm going to be talking about now. I also have a little bit of an exotic career, which is mainly worth just quickly mentioning because it tells you a little bit how I got here also to study this problem. So from 2005, 2013, after doing a postdoc here, actually, I decided to somewhat be unaffiliated. So I was an NSF grantee of different grants throughout those years. Then in 2009, I founded my little lab, which is pretty much me and a couple of people I hire every now and then, but essentially it allows me to work independently. And I've also been a visiting scientist in a bunch of places. That's also part of the story that brings me here. And finally, now I have a series of external affiliations, although my main affiliation is here at NICO. So now that the pandemic is over, hopefully I'll be more around and we can chat anytime you want. How did I get here? So in fact, I've been working in physical problems and complex system problems for a while, and already in 2012 with a good friend and colleague, Thilo Gross, when I was visiting Dresden at the Max Planck Institute for the Physics of Complex Systems, he brought to me an interesting question, which was very mathematical, about how certain networks, opinion networks, can fragment. And we made the analogy with the voter model in the new kind of online systems such as Twitter, which was quite recent at the time. We were also thinking of blogs in general. And then we showed that the fragmentation into these bubbles, isolated bubbles of conversation that don't talk to each other, is a very general mathematical result from a very theoretical approach, but it's a very general mathematical result when you have the type of connectivity that you have online. And that work that was done in 2012 went to sleep for a little time until it brought me to co-direct this SOL lab in Chile. So what is a SOL UC lab? It's a socialism lab at the School of Communications of the Universidad Católica de Chile. It's a relatively small team, although it's growing. It's about 3 anthropologists, 1 sociologist, 2 engineers. These are more part-time. 1 computer scientist who has his own business that partners with us, and 2 communications experts who are part of the team. So as you see, not many quantitative people. That's mainly the things that I've taught them, what the quantitative side is, but actually the more qualitative aspects of this work is really, really important beyond the quantitative foundation. The other thing I need to tell you about is how this SOL UC startup lab began, because I think that our perspective is really very strongly influenced by the fact that we work a little bit like a startup. What does that mean? Our funds don't really come from grants typically. They come mostly from consulting with different organizations. And that's really interesting because when you're working in social networks and you're trying to understand what people think about a given problem, and you're giving this information to a given client that hires us to understand what people are saying about them, it's quite different to do an academic research than to give them actionable intelligence. And what we have to give them is actionable intelligence, like something that they grab and they know, like, okay, now I can do this. Now I should do this in order to improve my image or in order to achieve such and such objective. Okay, so that's quite important. So how did this startup lab begin? And partly it was because in 2017, so already 5 years after we had published that paper, it was you will remember, the presidential campaign, very, very, exciting presidential campaign here in Chile, here in the States, sorry. And a lot of people in the world were talking about this post-truth. Where did this come from, right? How come people are talking about things that are not true and there's such important arguments in a campaign? And at the time I went to Chile and I gave a bunch of talks, and then I realized there was a huge interest in this because I was connecting this to a theoretical argument about the fragmentation of networks and the emergence of post-truth, and all kinds of people from like boards of director, banks and insurance association, the Congress of the Future organized by the Senate, et cetera, they all were inviting me to talk about this because people really wanted to understand how come people get into these like vicious cycles of believing their own stories within a certain community inside social networks. So after giving a bunch of talks, I met with Eduardo Arregada, who at the time was the dean of the School of Communications of the Universidad Católica in mid-2017s, and we decided to start this social listening lab by precisely giving these services to these people who were so interested in understanding what was happening, but now not only with a theoretical underpinning or a general explanation, but more with data analysis. So 2017, we had our first meetings. We kind of had our first consulting project with a big power company, Enel, which actually had a big problem because there was a snow in Santiago de Chile, which happens rarely, and a big part of Santiago had no power for like 4 or 5 days. The image of the company went downhill dramatically. They had a huge customer base on Twitter because they had managed to create a communication channel with the customers on Twitter. And the CEOs of the company thought this was amazing until they had their customers without power for 4 days, in which case they received an earful from every single person on Twitter that was following them. And until today, when they post something, like you can find tons of comments of people, yeah, you blah, 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 that you left me without power and this happened to me, et cetera, et cetera. So how do they deal with this? What happened? Why it happened, et cetera, was something that we tried to analyze in that particular project. But then we had a bunch of projects, a bunch of different contracts. In 2019, we started having some contracts with the Ministry of Education, with the Top 25 that was going to be organized in Chile, with the Ministry of the Environment. We had also some influence in the national press, because when you do these kind of studies, journalists are quite interested. And when you work with the School of Communications, they know all the journalists in the country, so it's really easy to make the contacts. Then we, in 2020, 2021, we established ourselves with more long-term contracts. We started working with CMPC, which has been a really interesting contract. It's a big company in Chile that worked with paper manufacturing and logging. And this brings us pretty much, I'm not going to give you all the summary, but pretty much until today, in which 2022, we've been dedicated to really formalize all the tools that we have been developed to analyze all these case studies, right? So to develop really a methodology that allows us to study social networks from a complex system perspective, which I think is quite important as a different point of view compared to what most people are doing in social networks. So what do we typically do at Sol? We collect the data. We use some sort of search terms through the Twitter API, typically, but we also do it with public pages in Facebook. We are also doing it with TikTok now, and also with Instagram. We essentially grab a date range, certain qualifiers, maybe the nationality of the person who posted, or the origin, or the region where the person is posting from. And then we capture everything that was published within a certain period of time using certain keywords or combinations of keywords, right? Then we do all kind of analysis, temporal analysis, interaction networks, semantic networks, etc. And then we present the result to the customers, usually in a meeting in which we also can give them some ideas about why what we are observing is happening and what one can do about it. I think it's another interesting experience of doing this beyond the academic world is to realize that when you're giving actionable intelligence to someone, you need to connect both to the top and to the bottom of the organizational scheme, right? Because the people who can make the decisions to actually see the value and change how the company behaves, or how the organization behaves, how the ministry behaves, are the people on top. But the people who actually have to operate it are the people at the bottom. So they also need to know what kind of messages to pass. And when we've only have meetings with the community managers, which are kind of like the people at the bottom in this organizational scheme, usually the contracts die out. And when we're only also meeting with the CEOs, the contracts also die out. So there's something to be said about how to connect and make this information into something useful for society. It means that you need to address all the levels of the organizations that you're interacting with. So before going into the main results that I wanted to present, I'll just give you a couple of examples of the kind of things that we do with Sol. You see, the first curve there, and these two curves actually have to do with a full year almost of data of all tweets related to subjects connected to the childhood in Chile. And this was a project that we did for UNICEF Chile, which we were trying to understand when people talk about childhood, what are they talking about? What are the concerns, et cetera, et cetera. This was also post-pandemic. There was a lot of people returning to school. When people return to school, at least in Chile, and this has been observed in many countries, there was a huge eruptions of violence among kids, because they were kind of like socially unadapted in some more than one way. There were a bunch of episodes of this that were in the press. This was some of the things that we collected. But beyond that, there were a lot of other questions that we were wondering about, that UNICEF was wondering about, regarding what kind of interest it had in the Chilean conversation about childhood. Here, I'm just going to mention one quick thing. This is one of the most common things that people do when they look at social networks. They're just looking at how many people are tweeting, for example, in this case, it's Twitter, about a given subject and a given day. But then also how many people are retweeting or putting like to this, right? Which is the interaction. Okay. So tweets per day capture not only the original tweet, but also the responses to that. Okay? And the interactions capture the people who just propagate this information. And sometimes the ratio between these two in the hands of an expert anthropologist is already quite interesting information. Something that has a lot of tweets and not so many interactions, it means it's a subject that generated conversation. Something that has a lot of interactions but very few tweets is a subject that was just propagated like a meme, right? So it's essentially just like there was something that was propagated a lot. And it's a different kind of conversation. And once you start looking at the peaks of this, you can find what days people were worried about childhood in Chile and what were they worried about, what was their typical argument, how much it propagated, and what kind of responses they received. And this scheme of understanding is some of the things that we've been developing as methodology, because it's not usually the kind of things that people look at when they look at these social network data. Most people in social networks data analysis are either on the total academic world, and then you're looking at all kinds of other questions, or they're in the communications world, in which case they're mostly in the advertisement universe, right? And they just want to know what kind of brand image the person, you are projecting through social media, and therefore they're just kind of counting likes. That's kind of like the most common thing. Or impressions. They call impressions. It's something more sophisticated. How much time you stopped at a post and actually looked at it, or move ahead, et cetera, et cetera. So all these things are interesting, but it's really not what I would call a complex systems perspective that kind of understands not only numbers and averages, but also structures and messages. This is another example of the kind of things that we do, of course, is just to draw the network, right? So here, there's also, by using some network approaches, network techniques that a lot of you know about, we can do mathematical filters in order to grab a network of all the people who were talking about the constitutional plebiscite in Chile. So Chile went through a couple of years of a lot of social turmoil. There was a presidential election, and there was also a new constitution that was written, and people were arguing if they would approve the new constitution or not. Spoiler alert, it was actually rejected about a month ago, and the new constitutional process started. But this network are the main people, the most relevant people talking about the constitutional plebiscite, and this network is the main people talking about the election, the presidential election, the second round of the presidential election. And the important thing to see here is that these are the main network out of a network of hundreds of thousands of people, or at least tens of thousands of people, depending on the case, depending on the period that we're looking at, et cetera, et cetera. And then we apply a certain number of filters, which is standard kind of centrality filters, page rank filters, et cetera, plus other filters that have to do with time. For example, people have to have been part of the conversation in peaks more than once. You know, because if you're like a famous like soccer star or something, maybe you tweet once, you get a lot of you appear to have a lot of influence, but you only opine about the subject once. You know, so you have to opine about the subjects more than once in order to be part of this. This kind of like different filters that involve the temporal dynamic, the structure of the network, through mathematical filters, bring us down to a number of, you know, usually around 100, 200 or something like that, at which scale we can start looking at each individual person. And each individual person starts representing a community in more than one way, right? And then you can really start seeing how these things are changing and what kind of structures emerge. For example, here we actually color, this is one of the candidates, this is the other one of the candidates, so the presidential election that this was monitoring. And here you see really the sphere of influence of each one of them. And you can see this was actually a third candidate that didn't go to second round, but he was kind of like more center. Both of these candidates were fighting for him. He's there in the middle precisely because of that. This is just like a typical force, I always forget the name, force field network diagram, you know, where you're essentially pushing the network, the nodes as far as possible, but then you're attracting them through the links. And this already gives you a very good structure of the kind of communities that we're looking at in this case. And you can see that the presidential election became very bipolar, while this conversation about the plebiscite of the new constitution became much more complex. Another thing that we do, and these are our typical 3 legs of analysis, are these semantic networks. The nodes are not people, or they're not accounts, which was in the previous case. Here, they're words. They're words that are being used in a series of texts that are being tweeted in this case. And what we do in this case is that we grab every pair of words that repeats a certain number of times, a high number of times. You include it, you include the pair of words, and you include a link between them. Okay? So these words that are linked are words that tend to appear very commonly in the same tweet in this particular case. And this is quite an interesting example. This is actually a data collection that we did. We've rarely till now done this beyond Chile or other Spanish-speaking countries, but here we actually did a data collection on QAnon. So many of you may have probably heard about QAnon conspiracy theory. It's a grand conspiracy theory that involves a lot of different smaller conspiracy theories in some kind of like almost, you know, I don't know, biblical fight between the good and evil in the mind of these people. And it has a very strong religious component, and that's what we were trying to look at by capturing everybody who used the hashtag #GodWins. The hashtag #GodWins became a really key hashtag in QAnon, and nobody that's just religious would tweet writing hashtag #GodWins. Only people affiliated to QAnon would use that, and that's why we thought it was a good term, because on top of it, a lot of the usual terms like when we go one, we go all, this is like an abbreviation of that, which they use a lot, was being actually kind of like filtered by Twitter because it had become such an important conspiracy theory, so we couldn't search through that because a lot of those tweets were discarded. However, #GodWins was harder to censor, and it was a good starting point to analyze this. And here's really interesting because you see some players like General Flynn, some people may know this, real Donald Trump, etc. But you also see all kind of religious associations that are being done. And you really see the extent to which the QAnon conspiracy theory has concepts that are really belong more to almost to a cult, you know, like to a religious cult. Right? And you can see it in this. And when you look at it with expert eyes, you can start looking at, for example, okay, there's Patriot and then there's #GodWins. Okay, so then our tools allow us to then generate the list. Which are the most important tweets, meaning the ones that receive the most feedback that use those 2 words in the data set that we have of, you know, hundreds of thousands or maybe 500,000 tweets. So then you can really start understanding stories that are hitting in the language that people are using, in who's talking to whom, and in when they said it. So going back in the 3 slides that I just showed you. And with all this information, you really can understand structurally what kind of conversations are happening with what kind of language and between what kind of people. And when you have a multidisciplinary team and you understand the socio-political context, that's why the soft abilities are super important in this case, not only the quantitative analysis. You really can get a picture out of this and understand what's happening. And that's what people often call digital ethnography. When you analyze individuals and you combine it with all this information, then you get to what is starting to be called digital anthropology. And this whole idea of digital anthropology is a term that I personally hadn't heard when we started this project. But for the last year, I've been hearing more and more. And I think that is something that is starting to become like the way that you understand this kind of more complex analysis through social networks. In this vein, UNESCO actually got very interested in this concept of digital anthropology, and they partnered with this LIVE Center to develop this field of study within UNESCO more strongly. And luckily, I was invited to write this small essay that should appear in the web pages of UNESCO in the near future, the next few months, in which I try to explain what we do with SOL and explain what I understand as a complex system approach of digital anthropology. And I kind of like, it's not because I wrote it myself, but I kind of like this first sentence because I think that it underpins the message that I would like to transfer, which is that the power of digital anthropology will only be unleashed when it becomes an applied science. That's my first sentence. I wanted to start with a strong statement. And I do think it's true. I do think that we're missing so much by looking at all these human problems through complex systems with all this quantitative data that we have today without looking at the possibilities of what can you do with it? What is the actionable intelligence that we are receiving through this analysis? All right, so now with this long introduction, I will get to the actual main results that I wanted to tell you about today. We analyzed Twitter data to try to understand how people were accepting the vaccine in Chile. It was a really, it gave us a lot of information about what was happening in Chile society, because to understand how people are absorbing the news or are participating of the process of vaccination, you need to understand what they're talking, not only when you interview them, but what they're talking amongst themselves, right? When you're not watching in some ways. And that's a great thing about Twitter in many ways. So why do you study vaccine-related conversations in Twitter? Of course, it is important to have high vaccination rates. Of course, we know that online misinformation is critical in the opinion that people have about vaccinations. We also know that social networks are key for people to create their environment through which they are for or against vaccination, right? So their social environment is in many ways determined by their social networks. And finally, why do we use Twitter? Well, we use Twitter mainly because it's the only system that exists where you don't have to belong to some kind of closed group in order to observe all the conversations that are being had about a subject, right? So it's the only social network where everything that you write, you have to assume it's public. And therefore, we can watch what people are talking about without attempting against their privacy. And also, because of the way that Twitter, you can tweet and respond to tweets, we can also see who's talking to whom. And that's really important to understand the structure of what's happening in these conversations in society. So although Twitter has other issues, and we all know that now it's being taken over, and who knows what's going to happen in the future, I think if Twitter doesn't exist in this current form in the near future, something else should be invented. And quite honestly, I would much rather it be some kind of open source of public system. So if anybody has an inspiration to do that, now it's the time to try to get in the market because of everything that is happening with Twitter. More concretely, what do we do? So we collected the data by grabbing all the people who used any term related to the COVID-19 vaccine and the vaccination process in Chile during a period of 6 months, during the 2021. This gave us 351,573 tweets generated by almost 60,000 accounts, right? Of people who really were using terms related to the vaccine. Interestingly, this period was very useful, and this was a perfect case study. Why? Because during that same period, we had all kinds of things happening in Chile with the vaccination and with the pandemic. So first, during these 6 months, Chile went from almost no one vaccinated, because the vaccines had barely been created, to almost 80% of the population vaccinated, right? So it was a period of time where you had a huge vaccination process that went really, really fast in the country. And the same 6 months, you also had almost a doubling of the number of deaths, right? Because of course, it's not an immediate thing that happens that suddenly the deaths are cured from one day to the next. And also you had these ups and downs of the daily cases, right? Which is the blue curve right there. So all this was giving you a lot of environment for there to be controversy about the vaccine, right? So you have a lot of vaccination, you still have a doubling of the deaths, you still have cases that go up and down. I draw your attention particularly to this period, which you can guess that will be the most controversial, right? Because you're having another wave, you're still increasing your cases, you're still increasing your deaths, and the number of vaccinated people is increasing super rapidly. So a lot of people will start saying like, oh yeah, this vaccine is useless, etc., etc. Look, almost half of us are vaccinated, and we're still having all these deaths, right? So all these statistics actually make this data a very unique data set that is really an interesting case study to understand how people absorb the information of vaccines and what their consequences can be. So what did we do with that? We grabbed a training set of 185 randomly selected accounts. Actually, we selected more, and then we had to drop some to have a more or less balanced number of accounts for that favor and disfavored vaccination. And then that's where the anthropologists' work really is super important. They kind of design a set of criterion to decide if someone was pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine based on what they wrote. Okay? And now, anti-vaccine doesn't necessarily mean that you assume that vaccines are going to, create a 5G antenna on you or something like that. Anti-vaccine could be anybody who would write a tweet that in our assessment, which we had to tabulate it to have a certain way of doing it formally, would discourage someone who read the tweet from getting vaccinated. Okay? So that would be an anti-vaccine person. Anybody who wrote, so someone, for example, there was political controversy. So some people say like, the stupid vaccine that this government brought is completely useless, So it was more against the government, but it was still something that would make people be discouraged from getting vaccinated, right? So the person didn't say, I hate vaccines, they just say this brand of vaccine is useless, right? Mainly to attack their government. So we ended up having this 115 accounts that favored vaccination, 70 accounts that disfavored vaccination. We had to take less that disfavored because the people who disfavored tend to tweet more often. So in order to have the number of tweets more or less balanced. And that all those 6,000 plus tweets of each type were our template language used by pro-vaccine and anti-vaccine people. Is what we use to train a machine learning algorithm, what kind of language, and that includes hashtag, combination of words, et cetera, would be used by people who favor vaccination versus those who disfavor vaccination. And to train, we gave it a score of 0, those that favored vaccination, and a score of 1 to those that disfavored vaccination. So what are the results? And so the results are quite dense. There's only like 3 slides, but each one of them is quite dense. So I'll go slowly through them. First, an interesting thing that comes from this diagram, as you will see in a minute, is that it gives us a natural way to divide the population between 4 categories. There are the more extreme pro-vaccine and anti-vaccine, and the more moderate pro-vaccine and anti-vaccine. Why? So first, how do we divide the people who encourage vaccination from the people who discourage vaccination? Right? So we need to decide at this number, anybody above will encourage vaccination, anybody below will discourage vaccination, anybody below will encourage vaccination. And this is a little bit arbitrary and it will never be perfect, but we can have a very good estimate by using a training set. So the top diagram is the distribution of scores, is the histogram of scores of the training set. And colored in green is the training set of those who favored vaccination, and colored in red is the training set of those who disfavored vaccination, right? And then, of course, you see that, it's a sanity check. Indeed, the people who disfavor vaccination tend to be closer to 1. When you reclassify it with a neural network trained, that will not be optimal. We use this as a training set and we gave it a 1, but it will never be exactly 1 for all of them. However, they tend to be grouped on this side, and these other tend to be grouped on this side, and there's a division in between at 0.40 something, and that's what we will decide divides the population in the general analysis once we give the score based on this neural network that we trained with this training set, the whole system, the whole population. Once we do that, we will be able to classify who's anti-vaccine and pro-vaccine in a general sense by picking those who are above or below this particular score. Now, as we know, there's people who are favoring or disfavoring vaccination and people who really are anti-vaccine or pro-vaccine, right? So it's a different level of intensity. How do you make the difference? Actually, this was quite interesting. It was something that came out of the data, and we've done this with new data, and it seems to be quite consistent. When you look at the language of something like this and look at the scores, in this case, this is the histogram of the whole data set, everybody in the data set, right? And you see what typical scores they have, okay? So it makes some sense that there will be some maximum near the center because most people will use a language that is not so extremely pro-vaccine or so extremely anti-vaccine. So it makes sense that there will be a maximum in the center and there will be some kind of tails at the edges. But then you have these secondary peaks. So it means that there's a number of people who are overrepresented with very high scores, very much disfavor vaccination, or very low scores, very much favor vaccination. And then you can go ahead and look at a little bit more in detail and look at now the scores, not of the users, which is the average of the scores of all their tweets, by the way. I didn't mention that, but it's kind of obvious in some ways. But rather the distribution of the scores of the tweets, okay, of the individual tweets, right? Some users can have many tweets, so that can be not exactly the same thing. And that's this blue curve that you see there, right? And then when you look at the blue curve, you see that these lateral peaks actually have kind of like responsibles that are very clearly marked with these red lines. Right? vertical red lines, very clear peaks. And then when you have a team of anthropologists, they can just go and look at each individual tweet and try to understand which tweets repeat exactly a number of like 0.87532 score or something, right? And then you see that there's a bunch of tweets that have exactly the same score and others that are right next to it. And then you start looking at why. And the reason why is quite obvious a posteriori, which is simply that when you are a fan of something, when you promote something, you tend to use the same language all the time, right? So when you're saying, when you hate vaccines, then you will say 5G, 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 Bill Gates, Bill Gates, Bill Gates, you know, like all your 4, 5, 10 tweets, whatever, they will all include those same words, and therefore they will have a very, very similar language. In the Chilean case, if you favored vaccine, this was something like the calls of the different municipalities to get vaccinated. So they use the same language. It's like vaccinations are open in such street from such time as such time for such category of ages, which is the way that it happened in Chile, right? So then they would use almost the same language, and that's why you got this peak, right? So this is actually telling you that very generally, you can have this approach to analyze data that is complex by looking at the language, training a neural network with the extremal positions, and then looking for these additional side peaks that will discriminate the more fanatic populations for each side. And then, somewhat arbitrarily, we can decide that the minimum between these two peaks, right, will be the division between the, what we call, actually, that's where we get to this point. You have the ones that favor vaccination, disfavor vaccination, but here the ones that promote it, promote the position, and those that don't promote the position between these two gray lines. And as a result, you end up having the pro-vaccine, we defining as pro-vaccines those who have a score between 0 and 0.17, as promoters, those who have a score between 0.17 and 0.45, inhibitors, 0.45, 0.71, and anti-vaccine, 0.79 to 1. Okay, so this could have been shifted because of the way that you train the neural network, right? Exactly the language that you use, this thing could have moved a little bit one way or the other if you overrepresented one population or the other, yet the shape would be somewhat the same. And yet you could always apply the same approach to try to understand how to divide your populations, because once you divide the population, you can start looking at other interesting things, right? So you can start seeing how each one of these populations behave. First, you can just compare the number of accounts, and then you will see the left column in this case are all accounts, the number of all accounts, and the right column is the top percent of accounts, meaning the accounts that have top 10% of the interactions. Okay? So the most influential accounts, right? The 10% top, the top 10% most influential accounts. And the distributions sometimes are similar, but sometimes change a little bit. And that's an interesting data to analyze too. So first, the number of accounts, you see that most people are in the middle, and most people are vaccine promoters rather than vaccine inhibitors, right? Now, the inhibitors are a huge population, although the anti-vaccine population in Chile is not particularly strong. I'm dying to make this study in somewhere else because you know, there's a whole lot of data that has to be analyzed, but I'm pretty sure in the United States will be a completely different situation. We can talk about that later in the talk. So that's the number of accounts. Now you can look at, for each one of the accounts, how active they are, the number of tweets typically per account. And here is where you really see that this, I would say, that is not, it doesn't show a huge trend, you know, it follows more or less what you would expect, but this one is kind of interesting. And if you take the top 1% of the interactions, it's even stronger, these two peaks on the sides. And what are those two peaks showing? Those two peaks are showing that the people who are activists tend to tweet more often. Right? Makes some sense. In this case, the pro-vaccine, actually most of these accounts that are very active are not necessarily individuals, they often organizations, right? So such, you know, the ministry of this or the municipality of that. And then finally, you can look at how successful each account is in getting their tweets promoted. So meaning how many interactions each one of their tweets receives. Right? And then you can see that they're actually interestingly aligned. I mean, you know, the promoter group kind of like tends to be more successful because a lot of these were people who were, in general, influencers in the broad sense of the term in Chile, which in the Chilean case, almost all of them were favoring vaccination, right? So there was no major political party or major person in the public sphere that would be anti-vaccine or even inhibitor, right? So that's why you have this peak. But otherwise, you see that the levels are quite homogeneous, right? And that's a little bit discouraging because we're talking about here a very well-informed tweet about the benefits of vaccination, and about here how you're going to grow a third eye with the COVID vaccine, right? So it's a little bit discouraging that they get the same amount of promotion, but other than that, the levels are not so surprising. Then you can look at the same kind of properties, but over time. Okay? And here it gets a little messy in more than one way. But one interesting thing is that first, if you grab each one of the categories here, if I go from bottom to top, and I calculate per category, what's their average score? So you have the individuals that tweeted that month, which not necessarily was everybody in that category. And then you have the kind of tweets that they generated. So you can see really for that month, the tweets generated by the people who fall into each one of the categories, what score do they have? And you could think that a category 1 month, when the vaccine situation becomes better, they would tend to be a little bit more positive, even if they're anti-vaccine. In fact, what you see is that this change, and when you plot it closer, you see it even more clearly, is very, very little. So this really, really doesn't change. So in some ways, people don't really change the opinion of what kind of style of language they're using pro or anti-vaccine over time, independent of all the things that were happening during these 6 months. Right? However, what people do is that they tend to talk more often. So the top one shows what fraction of each category was speaking at each month, in each month. And then you see that the biggest increase in those middle complicated months was the anti-vaccine group, right? Which was lower, but goes up more steeper. So essentially, the bottom line of this, other than some other anecdotal things that have to do with the Chilean case, is that people really don't change their opinion. And there's a lot of other sociological studies that show something quite similar, that people really don't change their opinion. They just don't express it so much, when they feel that their environment is not the correct one for their opinion. And they express it more when they feel that they have to say something about something. But they don't really change much what they think. Finally, the last nice results, of course, in this place like here, this is one of the interesting ones, is to see really what the network looks like. And now, because we categorize each one of the individuals between the 4 different categories, being the more extremes are the dark green and the dark red, and the lighter green and lighter red are the more intermediate, favoring and disfavoring vaccination, we can create the network. This is not the full network, but it is close to the full network, because there's a bunch of small dots really hiding inside here that you're not seeing so clearly. And we see a few things that we can look at, right? First, the network is not super segregated, and that may be a good thing, right? So people are talking to each other, right? Because sometimes one of the things we're afraid of is that some people that were anti-vaccine are just going to be talking amongst themselves and with nobody else. Although there's a caveat to that, there's a tricky, but I'll get to that in a minute. So they are kind of talking to each other, but they tend to group in communities. And you see here, you have the more promoters. Here you have the more anti-vaccines, and here you have kind of like a mixed conversation of both. Right? Here, of course, each individual dot, each node is an account, and each link is a reply, a citation, or a reference in this case. So it's not strongly aggregated into one group or the other. But when you look at the statistics of the network, you do see something that really reflects the case in Chile, which is the fact that the most important thing is that the betweenness of the anti-vaccine, the betweenness centrality of the anti-vaccine group is the lowest one. Right? What does that mean? It means that the anti-vaccines people in Chile tended to be in the periphery of the network. They were not occupying a central part of the network. And interestingly, in a diagram like this one, the nodes that are expelled to the edge of the diagram are indeed those the individuals that are at the edge of the conversation. There's a very close analogy between the position in the diagram and the role that you have in the conversations. Why? Because the nodes that tend to be pushed to the edge have less connection with nodes that are worse connected, right? And if you have few conversations with people who don't have many other conversations, you're not at the center of the conversation. Right? So that's kind of like a way in which you can read this mathematical information in a more sociological point of view. So indeed, in the case of Chile, and that was quite unique in Chile, and I would, as I said, I would love to do this experiment, this analysis in somewhere else. Um, one of the reasons why, and Chile now has one of the highest vaccination rates in the world, one of the reasons why that happened is because the anti-vaccine community was not central. And you can then look at what these people are, who they are in the case of Chile, et cetera, et cetera. And I would argue that that, as opposed to the United States, was a lot because the anti-vaccine community had no central organization. There was no political party, there was no movement, there was no relevant socio-political movement that took vaccine suspicion even, like in the States. A lot of people don't say, like, I'm not anti-vaccine, but we must emphasize the right that we have not to get vaccinated. That's their main point. We have the right not to get vaccinated. That's the only thing that matters for their political message, right? So they're not anti-vaccine, but they definitely have a central role, and they're inhibitors, right? And given that, this picture would have changed completely in a society like in the United States, I'm sure, and I would love to know how exactly. And to end, this is the final slide pretty much before the conclusions. Once we know who's talking to whom, we can actually also see how are these different communities talking amongst themselves. How many anti-vaccine are talking to pro-vaccine people? How many pro-vaccine people are talking to anti-vaccine people, et cetera, right? And here what you see is that we kind of split the network into each one of the communities. And actually, each one of these diagrams corresponds to the network diagrams if you only kept the nodes of the given community, right? So the more pro-vaccine to the most anti-vaccine community from left to right. And then these arrows show you what percentage of each one of the interactions goes from one community to the other, right? And what's immediately striking is that even in the Chilean case, where the vaccination was very successful, the anti-vaccine people are always trying to convince the pro-vaccine people, but the pro-vaccine people don't bother talking to the anti-vaccine people. So you see that the pro-vaccine people, 50% of the messages of pro-vaccine people is to other pro-vaccine, is responding to other pro-vaccine people, right? And only 0.3% of the conversations of anti-vaccine people are addressing anything that was said to them by the anti-vaccine people. Conversely, the anti-vaccine people, only 4% of their messages are to themselves, and a huge percentage of the messages are to the pro-vaccine people. And if you go to YouTube and you look at any conversation related to vaccine and look at the comments, you will see this in real time. It is extremely striking. If you go to a CDC YouTube channel conversation on the approval of the child vaccine, as I did before we got Leo vaccinated, and you look at the comments, there's, I don't know, half, 2/3 that are anti-vaccine. Like, you guys are killing us, you stop this, whatever, Fauci should go to blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. If you now go to an anti-vaccine channel and you look at the comments, no pro-vaccine person says anything. Nobody. Nobody is saying, like, come on, people, the vaccines are saving lives, whatever. It's like, sometimes someone, but most of it is like, yeah, I knew it. I've been told about this by my grandmother, whatever, right? I mean, it's like this all this piling up on the conspiracy theories. And this, I think, is one of the lessons of this study, because there's something that we're doing wrong. And going back to the beginning of this talk, the fact that people don't understand that vaccines are the reason why we can overcome the pandemic, the fact that it's not in the mind of everybody, is that this happened without having uncountable number of deaths, is something that we should really try to get people to understand properly, because otherwise we're already seeing it. Most people are saying, like, oh, I already had 2 vaccines, that's enough for me, no boosters for me, And it's like, I say, like, yeah, after how many stoplights do you stop stopping? It's like, it makes no sense to a rational mind when you look at the numbers that this will be a decision, but people are not thinking about these things in these terms. They're thinking about these things through the conversations that I'm showing you. So summing up, we find these 4 categories that naturally come out of the data by analyzing the data and vaccine conversations in Chile. We look now, after we can do the categories, we can look at the temporal dynamics, and we can look at their behavior and can differentiate how they behave. We can see the signatures of the success of the Chilean vaccination campaign. However, we also see the weaknesses of vaccination campaigns in general, in the sense that disfavoring accounts interact more with favoring accounts than vice versa. And as a final thoughts, I would argue that social network analysis can become a window to the public square. It is really important. A complex systems perspective is essential because a lot of people who are working on this are coming from a more traditional engineering or from a social sciences, and they use your usual statistics, your usual polling statistics, like Gaussians everywhere, averages everywhere. This is the mean number of things that you got, and that's it. You know. And when you look at things from a complex systems perspective, sorry, you are looking at structures. You're trying to understand much more than that. And finally, I would argue that digital anthropology really needs to become an applied science, and the complexity science is essential for the development of digital anthropology. And I hope that more than one person here will get interested in the subject and can contribute, because I think it's a very important subject. And with that, maybe I have a couple of minutes for some questions, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Cristian. It's really great to welcome you here and listen to your research, which really can be quite applied. You mentioned working with the government of Chile. I'm wondering, the research that you shared on COVID was very descriptive. Was there advice that you provided to the government as you were in the middle of this that your analysis helped?
Yeah, so one of the things that we actually did was, more than advice, was we organized a forum when we were like halfway through this study, and it was, it was still during these 6 months, in which we highlighted the fact that some messages could be inhibitors for vaccines without being anti-vaccine. So essentially, we kind of like called a lot of people of the political class beyond the government, because a lot of the criticism came because of political quarrels. Essentially, people were being vaccine inhibitors because they didn't like the government indirectly. And I think that just bringing this to their attention, just showing that the algorithm classified them as vaccine inhibitors, while they said like, oh, no, but I'm pro-vaccine, I just hate this government, made them be toned down a little bit their rhetoric. And I think that made a difference.
Can you hear me? I have a question from the online audience. They ask, you preserved a lot of text-based work. How does digital anthropology work on video images that are harder to contextualize?
That's a good question. For now, what we're doing is we're textualizing. So in fact, in TikTok, for example, we now have a tool that extracts the audios and transforms it into text. And in Instagram, we also have a tool that we're finishing the development of a tool that grabs the images that often has text and extracts the text. To make conceptual analysis, you need the words in one way or another, right? Not just the sound. Although the question of like to what extent you could somehow intuit emotions out of the sound or intonation of a voice, that's a really interesting question, but that's beyond what we're capable of doing right now. The way we're dealing with that right now is just simply translating multimedia into text, and then using the additional information that often comes with multimedia, which are hashtags, and also who's responding to whom and who's communicating in what community.
Hello, my name is Alan. So you're able to read and see the text, and are you able to identify specifically the person and who they're talking to, and you can analyze not only this, but you could analyze other things like politics and that's so. You share that a little bit of discussion about that, because it's kind of scary. That could go quite uniquely the opposite direction, considering some of the history we have.
It definitely could. So in Twitter, one advantage or disadvantage, depending how you look at it, is that everything that you post is public in most of the cases. There's some ways in which you can restrict some people who view it or not, but typically everything that you post is public. So people have to assume that a tweet will be public. Actually, every time you tweet, it creates a permanent web page with that tweet. So like a lot of people don't realize that, and they think that they're tweeting just to a couple of friends, but in fact, it's a permanent record, right? So in that sense, buyers beware, but we don't have to deal with that. People should know that in some ways, right? That their tweets are public. Now, a different thing is what kind of information you're going to extract. In Twitter, you can be anonymous. You don't need to give your name in your account. And there's some famous anonymous accounts that people wonder like who it is, and eventually they're ousted or something like that. So how much the person is a given person, sometimes we've been interested in that. Of course, when we figure it out, we never make it public, but just more like an ethical decision, right? I mean, you could, with publicly available information, identify people and put it in the front page of a newspaper and said, this person said that, you know? It's totally possible. That's the people who use Twitter who have to be aware of that, and we wouldn't do it. We would use it in a different way, but that's a decision. And I agree with you that that's tricky. Finally, you can then cross-correlate data to really understand who the person is in more than one dimension. We're capturing the people who used a given term, like vaccines, for example. We don't care who that person is, but maybe that person is being captured in another project where we were looking at who was voting for whom, and in another project where we were looking at who was pro or anti climate change measures or something, right? So in reality, you very quickly could do a huge classification of people, and I think that that the fact that that can be done is unstoppable. The question is more, who will use it for what? And the problem is that right now, these things, the latest version of what I'm telling you, meaning like classifying someone in several different axes in order to have like a complete profile based on what they post themselves online, is something that advertising companies are already doing, political campaigns are already doing. And these kind of studies are not necessarily doing. So I think that it's not so much we should stop this possibility from happening as much as it can be scary. It's more like we need to be aware that it's out there, and the people who want to use it for constructive public things that are open, things that are published, that are not for some kind of secret agenda, we should take initiative of using it that way, because the other people are using it already. That would be my comment.
I just had a quick question. So all these results you showed are in some sense a result of Twitter's ecosystem, right? Like how you interact, which tweets you see, and that's kind of held by a private corporation. But I guess my so I'm a lot of thought right now about network engineering, right, and kind of designing optimal outcomes. And I wonder if you kind of were able to change the ecosystem, how robust the results would be, and if you had thought about that at all.
So yes, we thought about that. As a organization that does research that even when it's private for customers, it is associated to a university. We never feel that we have the authority to try to influence society in a way that is direct, because essentially it would mean like the university is trying to change society through a social network intervention, right? So sure, of course, with this information, people can try to change it, and a lot of the side that is actionable of this intelligence is precisely the possibility of changing what people think about things or who's talking to whom, right? And this is done. And this is done in a way that I think can be extremely virtuous, in the sense that it doesn't have to be done, for a secret message or by killing the person who actually is the critical node in the conversation, which you could totally decide to do in some universe. I mean, I wouldn't, but you know what I mean? Like some dictatorship, some authoritarian government could decide to do. You can just do it by inviting people to openly talk with you. So I mentioned the case of Enel, which had this huge problem because they left half of Santiago without power for about a week. And they had permanent critics after that. People who would use any excuse to tell the company how much they sucked, essentially, right? And to contaminate the Twitter, etc. So what Enel did was, with our data, they grabbed it and they found kind of critical people who are well located, and they openly invited them to talk to their company. They said, like, you have these public things. We know that you think. We really apologize. We would like to explain you why it wasn't so easy. Why it's not like we just were neglecting, right? I mean, neglectful. There's the thing that the kind of trees in Santiago lose all the, you never have snow. That means that most of them lose their branches. That means that we had like 5,000, cables down in the city, and that's what. So this really did change the tone of the conversation online. Now, on the other extreme, I mentioned that Claudio Villegas, that was one of the main authors, got to work in the government now. That's partly because at some point he left Sol to work in the campaign of the current president. And there you can do other kind of things, but that we can talk in a different moment. I mean, meaning like you can connect with people in an indirect way, and if the right people tweet the right things at a given moment, they can change the dynamics of the network. But of course, that's beyond what we would do as a lab, because it's more like political influence. But of course, political campaigns are doing that already.
I think we have run out of time, but thank you so much. Fascinating conversation. I wish I had time to ask about how you think, your research will change with changes in Twitter, but maybe that'll be an off-site conversation. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming Professor Huepe, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.